All right, guys, we are finishing up our discussion of the Middle Ages, Part 4. We left off talking a little bit about Thomas Aquinas, the development of the scholastic system, the development of, as well, the sacramental synergism of the Roman Catholic Church. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about the corruption of the papacy. And then, if time permits, we're going to begin our discussion of the forerunners of the Reformation. Plan to finish up that discussion on Thursday and then do our review for exam number 3. And that will get us where we need to be before you guys go and celebrate Christmas. We've already talked in this class a little bit about the corruption of the papacy during the Middle Ages. The papacy, as we've discussed, really began to take shape when certain bishops of Rome began to elevate and consolidate the authority and power that they had as the Bishop of Rome. I think all the way back to Leo, really at the very beginning of the Middle Ages, when he began to argue and articulate the argument from Matthew 16:18 that Peter was the head of the church, that Peter was the rock on which the church was built, and therefore Peter and his successors ought to be viewed as the highest representative of Christ on earth, the vicar of Christ. That's how the argument went in Leo's mind, and that argument has been repeated ad infinitum ever since by Roman Catholics who are convinced that the Bishop of Rome represents the highest religious, spiritual authority on earth, and that he is Peter's successor. Now, we've already talked about why that view is an inadequate understanding of Matthew 16:18, an inadequate understanding of church history, and really falls flat as an argument. And you saw also some of that in William Webster's book, The Church of Rome at the Bar of History, that that's not how the early church understood that verse, and that's not how we should understand that verse either. But that is the platform on which papal power and authority began to be built. And we saw that power exercised and applied by Leo, not only in the West, because he had one of the weak Western emperors declare him to be essentially the highest spiritual authority, or at least declare Rome to be the highest spiritual authority in the West. We saw Leo apply that authority at the Council of Chalcedon. Although he used that authority to good ends with the Chalcedonian Creed, we start to have a precedent set for Rome interfering in the theological debates of larger Christendom. Calvin himself, we talked about this as well, in his Institutes, looked back at Leo and Gregory and some of those other early bishops of Rome and saw them in a positive light. And yet, as the history progresses throughout the Middle Ages, some of the precedents that were set have very, very negative ramifications. And what we see with the papacy in particular is that principle where absolute power corrupts absolutely. That certainly takes place in Rome with the Bishop of Rome, with the see of papal power. And so you have, over the Middle Ages, this slow development in which the Pope is consolidating power to himself. And we're at a time, especially in the early Middle Ages, even through the time of the Frankish domination with Charlemagne and others, where it's more of a tribal environment in Europe. It's the feudal system. It's not a system of nations yet. Nationalism will come on the scene really in the 12th and 13th centuries is where nationalism really starts to gain a foothold in Europe. And I mentioned in a previous lecture how if you were to ask a typical farmer or soldier even during this early part of the Middle Ages what nation he belonged to, he might not actually be able to tell you. He could tell you what tribe he was part of, he could tell you what feudal lord he served, and he could tell you who his bishop was, but it was really the Roman Catholic Church that provided the glue that held all of these various tribal groups. They were often in conflict with one another, and yet there was some continuity provided in Western Europe through the Roman Catholic Church. And the head of the Roman Catholic Church was the Pope. And the Pope then was viewed as the de facto spiritual leader of Western Europe. The western half of the Roman Empire had dissolved. It had been cut off from the other 4 seats of patriarchal power or authority that had existed in the United Roman Empire before the fall of the western half. Those places include Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, and all 4 of those still exist within Eastern Orthodoxy, but Rome had been cut off from those, and so there was no balance of power. Things just continued to escalate. It got so bad that in the 11th century, in 1054, the Pope decides that he's going to send a delegation over to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and he's going to demand that the Eastern Church recognize him as the most important spiritual leader in the world. So we're talking about arrogance that has been unchecked. It is bolstered by a faulty theological argument. In the Middle Ages, it is also bolstered by a fraudulent document, the Donation of Constantine, where, according to this fraudulent document, Constantine himself empowered the Bishop of Rome to essentially be his emperor in the West when Constantine moved his capital city to the east. There's been no checks or balances on papal power, and even the emperors of Europe are recognizing the Pope as an authority that even transcends their office. So to be the Pope is to be very much the king of the world, at least in the West, to be the spiritual king of the world. Within Rome itself, this political power that has now corrupted the spiritual office of being the pastor of the church in Rome. I mean, we're talking about being the head pastor of the church in Rome, but now you're not just the pastor, you're the emperor of the world. People are no longer thinking about, spiritual leadership and service and selflessness as Pope. They are thinking about the wealth and power and prestige that comes from being the Pope. That attracts a certain kind of individual who is not known for Christ-like attitudes or apostolic type of selfless humility, but instead the most corrupt and power-hungry type of people, which is why when we get into the 8th and 9th centuries, an era that we already talked about, you have popes killing one another. It really gets bad in the 10th century. You have popes killing one another in order to become the next pope. And these rival factions in Rome fight to be pope. Now, we understand that there are some churches in America today where you have rival factions and people are trying to, influence the pastor and churches get split. But this is rival factions to a degree that we could never possibly understand, because it is trying to become the people involved in these rival factions are trying to control the government of Rome. They're trying to put their person in a position of unchecked and unmitigated power. So that's what the papacy becomes in the Middle Ages. Well, its authority, the papal authority, is going to be challenged now as we get into the late medieval period. And that's because of the rise of nationalism. It's because there are now some of these emperors who are going to stand up to the Pope and are going to challenge whether or not an Italian guy thousands of miles away ought to dictate what happens in Switzerland or in Germany or in France or in England. It's France and England in particular that initially buck papal authority, and that brings us to another really crazy time in the history of the papacy. We already mentioned that book, The Bad Popes, which is a great apologetic if you're interested in kind of digging up dirt on the Roman Catholic Church. And it's not like dirt that didn't happen, it's actual history, and showing them from their history that this whole idea of papal succession is corrupt to the core, and you can prove the corruption because of some of the people who are in this line of succession. This is another period of time here in the 13th and 14th centuries I suppose it's mainly the 14th and early 15th century. It's the 1400s where this is finally resolved, though it starts in the 1300s. But this period of time is another place in history where you can show Roman Catholics that this idea of an unbroken chain of papal succession just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense biblically. It doesn't make sense theologically. It doesn't make sense historically. And we've already talked about some of the biblical and theological problems with that Petrine succession model, but here's another place where the historical evidence completely obliterates the Catholic view. Because we are going to have a time now when there's going to be multiple popes, and each of these multiple popes is going to claim to be the true pope, and eventually all of these multiple popes are going to be denounced by a Catholic council as being false popes. So according to the findings of the Catholic Council themselves, there's a break in the line of papal succession. This starts with a time period that we call the Babylonian captivity, and we'll talk about that in just a moment.
Question about the gift of Constantine that you mentioned.
The donation,
Does modern day Vatican confirm that letter, or that so-called letter?
No, it's been exposed for a long time, all the way back in the, I think, 12th and 13th centuries. There were already scholars who were questioning the validity of this document, which first surfaced, I believe it was in the 9th or 10th centuries. So, no, it has long been proven to be a forgery and a fraudulent document. But at the time, in the 9th and 10th centuries, when people initially received it as being authentic, it greatly bolstered the claims of the popes themselves that they had a right to rule certain areas around Rome. And Charlemagne and other of the Frankish emperors, they bought it. And as a result, they helped to restore, they thought they were restoring the Pope to his rightful place. They helped to elevate the Pope to a place of not only, again, spiritual influence, but really political power.
One follow-up question. With that, they were able to seize or try to seize properties and lands if they were making a claim to be over all of the churches?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The donation of Constantine enabled the papacy to seize control of large portions of land around the city of Rome itself and in other parts of Italy. And now, as this becomes part of what the papacy represents, celibacy has always kind of been a spiritually noble ideal, but now the Catholic Church is going to begin to mandate celibacy. You say, well, how do you know it happened this late? Because in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which shares almost 1100 years of history with the Roman Catholic Church, celibacy is not mandated. So Eastern Orthodox clerics are allowed to be married, but Roman Catholic clerics are not. And historians believe that part of the motivation for mandating celibacy was that the Catholic Church wanted to inherit the land that was possessed by these priests. Well, if the priests have an heir, the land doesn't go to the Catholic Church, it goes to the heir. But if priests don't get married, then they can't have any legitimate heirs. So priests during this time have mistresses and illegitimate children, and all sorts of chaos is happening. But there's no legitimate heir for the land to pass to, so the land becomes part of the holdings of the Roman Catholic Church. So not only that, but popes are able to collect taxes. So indulgence money and other things is coming from all over Europe to fill up the coffers of Rome. Popes are able to raise armies. I mean, that's how the Crusades start, is that Pope Urban II preaches crusade, and armies of Europe go down to fight against the Muslim powers in the Middle East. So you have, again, the pastor of Rome acting really as the spiritual emperor of all of Europe. He's collecting money, he's raising armies, he has land holdings, and the papacy has become very much a political position of power.
Dr. MacArthur said a while ago that we as pastors, our predominant way in the way we is really this through preaching. But how about the popes? Do they have that type of the way they can communicate to the people like in preaching type, or you know what do they have preaching or service wherein people will gather and listen to his exposition of the word as popes?
Well, the Roman Catholic Church by this time has become very traditional, the sacramental system now is being codified during this portion of time. In the 1200s is when the sacramental system is made official, and then it's reiterated in the 1400s. So we have during this period of time the sacramentalism, the traditionalism, and so on that's really being codified in the church. So a lot of the official religious activities of the Pope involve, I think, traditional sacramental acts. Again, everything in the Catholic Church at this time is taking place in Latin. That's a language that is largely no longer spoken in the western half of the Roman Empire when we get to this time period, because especially up in Europe, I mean, we do have the Romance languages, which are kind of evolved from Latin. It would be, Spanish and Italian and Romanian and French and Portuguese. But you also have these Germanic tribal languages that are intermingling in all of this, German and English. So nobody speaks Latin anymore except for people who go to the monasteries and learn Latin so that they can communicate about theological and religious things. That's part of the reason that we need a Reformation, is because the Word of God is being held captive in Latin. And again, the irony is rich because the Latin Vulgate was translated so that the common people could have the Bible in their own language, and now it's being held captive in that very translation 1100 years later. So all of that is part of it. But, I think maybe in answer to your question, I think largely the public interaction of popes with the people was more sacramental and ceremonial, though he certainly had an entire infrastructure of bishops and cardinals and priests and a huge infrastructure by which he could influence people and reach the ambitions and goals that he had set out for himself. So I mean, again, they're treated as royalty, and they view themselves as royalty, and it's even reflected in the gaudy and opulent dress that they parade in, which in some ways takes its design from certain aspects of the Old Testament priesthood. I think that's kind of what they're trying to copy. But, I mean, the showiness and the opulence and everything that characterizes the Catholic Church today are things that were developed during this time period.
Yeah, with regards to the Pope, so again, I read a long time ago that there was a name like Black Pope, and the Pope is just a puppet, and the real Pope is a Black Pope. Have you?
I am not familiar with that, but it's possible that there may have been. I mean, the history of the papacy at times is so bizarre and so corrupt that certain, you hear stories, and some of them may be legends, but they may be legends that are actually based in a certain level of fact. For example, there's a legend about a woman pope, that there was actually a female pope at one time. And many historians are not sure if that actually took place or if it's just that there were certain women of influence who were so influential, due to romantic trysts and other things that they had with the popes, who were so influential that the people kind of assumed that that there was actually some sort of female influence that was actually pulling the strings. And so this idea of a female pope developed out of that. So yeah, there are times when it's so corrupt and so bizarre that I wouldn't put it past the possibility of there being some truth to even the most outlandish sounding legends. In fact, when Luther and we'll talk about this next semester, but when Luther visited Rome in 1510, this was still 7 years before he nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg castle door. And he was super excited to go to Rome because he had a lot of spiritual questions, and he assumed that the people in Rome had it all together because that's supposed to be the headquarters of Christianity. When he got there, he was utterly disappointed and disillusioned. It's part of what sparked really his own journey away from Rome. But the people in Rome, this is according to Philip Schaff, who records this, the people in Rome told Luther that they were convinced that the papacy was so corrupt. They said, they had a saying in Rome that if there is a hell, Rome is built on top of it. So there was no hiding it from the people in Rome itself that this was a system that was utterly corrupt. And what I want to show you in this is not only do I want to equip you for apologetics with your interactions with Roman Catholics, but I want to show you really the impetus for the Reformation came as a result of the Reformers were convinced that Christ is the head of the church, and the Catholics were convinced that the Pope is the head of the church. That was the issue that sparked the Reformation. Now, sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia, solus Christus, soli Deo gloria, those all come out of that. But the issue was, who is the head of the church? Is it the Pope or is it Christ? And if you answer A, you're a Catholic, and if you answer B, you're a Protestant. But we'll get to that. All right, so the Babylonian captivity. In 1305, or from 1305 up to 1377, we have this roughly 70-year period of time when the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon, France. And so it's called the Babylonian captivity because it lasted for roughly 70 years. And of course, it takes its name from the biblical Babylonian captivity, which lasted 70 years in Israel's history. Boniface VIII was the pope at the time. Philip of France and Edward of England were in conflict, and Boniface, as again kind of the de facto spiritual leader of Europe, thought that it was his place to try and intervene and mediate between these two kings who were at war with one another. No one listened to him, and so Boniface VIII issued a papal bull or a papal decree forbidding the collection of money for the church, and they were using this in both France and England to pay for the war. And so the Pope said, look, no more taxes, no more raising money for your war efforts since you guys are ignoring me, essentially. Edward responded by just disregarding what the Pope said. He's all the way over in England, so he can get away with that. Philip took things to an even more drastic measure. He stopped sending the Pope his share of taxes. Boniface excommunicates him, and Philip took an army with him, went to Rome, kidnapped the Pope, and confined him to prison. So here we have emperors now standing up to papal power, and this is going to represent something of a shift in the way that Europeans begin to think about themselves. They're going to start thinking, for a time there's been king and pope, but pope has kind of been slightly above king. That's slowly going to be reversed. Philip seizes the Pope, confines the Pope in prison. He dies there in 1303. And now the French essentially have control of the papacy because of the power that they've exerted over the Pope through Philip's actions. Benedict XI, Pope for only 9 months, and then Clement V, a French elected Pope, moves the papacy to Avignon, France. So now we have essentially a puppet papacy that is under the direct control of the French authorities. And for 70 years, 7 successive popes, all of whom are French and weak in terms of their determination to resist imperial authority, none of them moved the papacy back to Rome. So for 70 years, we have a pope, but he's not in Rome. He's in Avignon, France. Now this makes everybody else in Europe mad because there's other nations that are starting to form that don't like France all that much, among them the Holy Roman Empire and also England. And so there's 70 years of time where we essentially have a French puppet for a pope. Babylonian captivity results in two things. We have the severe weakening of papal power, because now the power and dominance that popes enjoyed really all the way from the 9th century up through the 13th century has been broken. And emperors and kings are now starting to dominate. And we also have a severe conflict over who the real pope or who the pope should be, because the French keep electing French popes, and the rest of Europe is upset about that. That leads then to what is called the Papal Schism. From 1378 to 1417, period of 40 years, we have multiple popes. Urban V, who's the kind of the last of these Babylonian captive popes, he attempts to move the papacy back to Rome. So he wants to move it back to Rome because really Rome is where the papacy ought to be. If you're going to be the Bishop of Rome, you should probably be in Rome. Gregory XI, who comes after Urban, finally puts an end to the exile by moving the papacy back to Rome. But there are a large contingency of French cardinals who want the papacy moved back to Avignon, France. The next pope, Urban VI, he essentially makes campaign promises in order to be elected pope, promising this large block of French cardinals that if they elect him pope, he will move the papacy back to France. When they elect him pope, he reneges on his campaign promises. So he gets them to make him pope, and then he refuses to move the papacy back to France. The French cardinals are so upset that they say, fine, if you won't move the papacy back to France, we'll go back to France and elect our own pope. And so with Urban VI, then, we begin this schism within the papacy. The French cardinals declare Urban VI to be illegal, and they elect a French man, Clement VII. And for the next 40 years, the Roman Catholic Church has multiple popes, multiple colleges of cardinals, and each pope anathematizes the other. And pretty much, if you're French, you accept the French pope, and if you're anybody else in Europe, you accept the Roman pope. And so these popes are essentially claiming that the other pope is an unbeliever. That's what excommunicate means, and anathematize. And so we have popes telling us that other popes are actually anti-popes. It's so intolerable that in 1409, there's an ecumenical council called at Pisa, which attempts to resolve the situation. But the problem is it only makes the situation worse. The council at Pisa deposes both of the popes, the pope in Rome and the pope in Avignon, and elects a new pope, Alexander VI. But the other two popes don't listen to the Council of Pisa, so now we have three popes. And for the next 8 years, we will actually have three popes, one in Rome, one in Florence, and one in Avignon. So we will have multiple popes, again, all of them excommunicating the other guy, all of them claiming to be the true pope. This is the situation that exists in Europe when John Huss is preaching in Prague. Okay, John Huss dies in 1415, just a few years after this, and when he is preaching that Christ alone is the head of the church, that makes a lot of sense to people, since on a human level, we have multiple popes who are all claiming to be the head of the church, and all claiming that the other two guys claiming to be the head of the church are in fact counterfeits and need to be deposed. Finally, the Papal Schism comes to an end at the Council of Constance, which was held in Germany from 1414 to 1418. This council, the Council of Constance, is the council that burned John Huss at the stake. So I'm just making some connection points here for things we're going to talk about a little bit later. But at the Council of Constance, then, we finally have an end put to this schism. Now, how do they resolve this? How do they maintain a line of papal succession? They don't. Instead, they do the same thing that the Council of Pisa did, except they're more successful. They depose all three of the reigning popes, announcing all three of them to be illegitimate. So it's not like we picked one and he's our guy. Nope, all of you are false popes, and they elect a completely new guy, Martin V, to be the pope. So we have a breach in this idea of papal succession, represented not so much by the Babylonian captivity, though that explains how the height of papal power in the 13th century diminished so dramatically, which also was part of laying the table for the Reformation, because now we have kings and princes in Europe who are willing to stand up to the Pope and say, no, I'm not going to let you kill Martin Luther. I'm not going to let you kill whoever it is. I'm going to protect them. But we also have now a time in the history of the Catholic Church where there is no explanation for how this works within the idea of papal Petrine succession, because there's an end to the succession. Multiple popes, each claiming to be pope, and finally a council saying none of them was legitimate. Here's what John Huss said about the Council of Constance. I think this is kind of interesting. He says, "This council is a scene of foulness. For it is a common saying among the Swiss that a generation will not suffice to cleanse Constance from the sins which the council has committed in this city." So even the council that denounced this was full of corruption. And that's, again, part of the reason that there was a need for Reformation, because the Catholic Church, and again, when I say Catholic Church, I'm referring specifically to the Pope, the cardinals, bishops, and priests. Within the Catholic concept of church, common people, at least at this time period, were not considered part of the church. They communed with the church, but only the priests and the monks were considered part of the church. The church itself was utterly and abysmally corrupt, and it was corrupt from the head down. And this is why there was the need for Reformation. So here we have a chart then summarizing the Papal Schism. You can see Urban V, he wants to move it back to Rome, but unsuccessful to do that, the last of the Babylonian captivity popes. Gregory XI finally does. Urban VI promises to move it back to France, but then reneges on that promise. And as a result of that, we have this new pope, Clement VII, who is elected by French cardinals. And you have two popes then, Boniface IX, Innocent VII, Gregory XII in Rome, and then Clement VII and Benedict XIII in Avignon, and then thanks to the Council of Pisa, which tried to resolve the situation but only made it worse, Alexander, and then John the 23rd. And by the time we get to the Council of Constance, Gregory, Benedict, and John are all claiming to be pope, and the Council of Constance says, no, none of you guys are pope. Martin's pope. Who's Martin? Well, Martin V. He becomes the pope. Now, this also represents a shift in within the Roman Catholic system between a balance of power between councils and popes. Okay, remember when we go all the way back to talk about these ecumenical councils that we've talked about in this class, it was the emperor who called those councils, and the emperor was viewed as an authority that was higher than the council itself. Now, from an ecclesiastical perspective, from a theological perspective, we recognize that the council represents more of the authority in a non-authoritative church history sense than an emperor does. But from the viewpoint of the people who were involved, the emperor was the authority and the council was subservient to him. He's the one that called the council. And if he wanted to invalidate a council, he could, because he was the final authority. When there was no longer an emperor in the West, the Pope became that authority. So the Pope was the authority, and councils were subservient to popes. But now, as a result of this, councils are going to become the authority, and popes are going to be subservient to councils. Because Constance was a council, that dismissed the Pope. And so after Constance, you won't have the Pope as the primary authority in the Roman Catholic system in the same way as he was before the Council of Constance. And there's actually a bit of friction that results in all of that. The Council of Basel and the Council of Basel declared that the real authority in the Catholic Church resides in general councils and not in the Pope. And Martin V didn't like that. And neither did his successor, Eugenius IV. But finally, the Pope was forced to recognize that councils are the ultimate authority in the Catholic Church. So this represents a major weakening of papal power, not a lessening of papal corruption, mind you, but a weakening of papal authority, and that was necessary for Reformation to be able to take place. Yep, Josh.
How big was this council? I'm trying to get my mind to wrap around the fact that you've got men from France, Rome, and Florence all contending for an office in the council, somehow over all of them. It says none of you are. So how was this a church-wide?
This would have been a Western council. So it was an ecumenical council of the Roman Catholic Western Church. So it was bishops from all over Europe who were there. And it met over a period of 4 years. So this was, people were moving here for a long period of time. And over that time, all of the main leading bishops throughout all of Europe would have participated. So it was a major council. But not an ecumenical council in the sense that it involved the Eastern Orthodox Church, only the Western Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, Alex.
The Papal Schism, is that part of the Great Schism?
No.
No, okay.
No, sometimes you'll read in history books that it'll refer to the Papal Schism as a Great Schism, but really that's not the best way to refer to it. I mean, it was a significant event, especially in the history of Roman Catholicism and the Papacy. But the Great Schism is generally used to refer to the East-West Schism of 1054. So the East-West Schism of 1054 is Roman Catholicism breaking off from Eastern Orthodoxy. We're now 300 years past that. We're in the 1300s when this Papal Schism begins, and it finally ends in 1417, 1418, right around there when the Council of Constance ends.
And that would be part of the Babylonian captivity?
Well, the Babylonian captivity precedes the Papal Schism. So for 70 years, we have the Pope moved from Rome to Avignon, France. When he finally moves back, that's what sparks this schism, because the French, they liked having the Pope in their pocket. And when the Pope moves back to Rome and refuses to move back to France, the French cardinals, which represents a very powerful block of cardinals at this time period, they say, you know what, forget it. We have enough people here, we can do our own thing. And so they split. So it's the rest of Europe and the French. It's not completely untypical or unbelievable, I suppose. But the French cardinals, they determine that they are going to set up their own pope, and that's why we have two popes. So Babylonian captivity for 70 years, and then Papal Schism for 40 years after that. But 110 years of really the utter weakening of papal power, to the point now where kings and princes and lords are going to be willing to take a stand against the Pope. This is opening the door for Reformation to be possible. Because there have been protest groups before this time, but the power of the papacy is so dominant that it crushes any opposition. But in God's providence, the weakening of papal power allows an opportunity in Europe for there to be a Reformation that is not completely wiped out. Yeah.
Are there any remnants of the French papacy still today, or how long did it last?
Any remnants of the French papacy? Not that I'm aware of at all. My understanding is that after the Council of Constance, everyone, because it included French cardinals at that council, everyone was in agreement that the only solution is to completely obliterate the mess and to start over. And so Martin V represents starting over.
What was happening in the Eastern Church at this time? Was it growing in corruption as well, or?
Yeah, the Eastern Church was growing in corruption. The Eastern Church had its own issues, and actually we're going to talk about that a little bit in just a moment, because the Byzantine Empire was slowly being reduced in size until finally in 1453 it gets completely overrun by the Muslim Turks, the Ottoman Turks. And at that point, there are still Christians who live and maintain their Christianity under Muslim rule. But when Turkey becomes Muslim, that represents a major change, even in the way that Eastern Orthodoxy identifies itself in the world. The growth of sacramentalism, much like in the Roman Catholic Church, exists in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Unlike the Roman Catholic Church, which went towards scholarship and scholasticism and systematic theology, and we see the fruit of all of that even in Western society today. I mean, that's part of what we study here at the seminary. The Eastern Orthodox Church went towards mysticism and embraced mystery and negative theology and those kinds of things. And so their tradition took them in a bit of a different direction, even though they embraced the same hybrid synergistic sacramentalism that the Roman Catholic Church embraces. But it is kind of interesting what we talked about in an earlier class. Tradition leads you all over the map, and you can see the divergent paths on which it can take a church simply by comparing how different Roman Catholicism is from Eastern Orthodoxy, even though they share the first same millennium of church history. There are some very different distinctives between the two groups. Yep?
Did the Crusaders help establish financial wealth to these popes?
Well, that was certainly part of it. The Crusades brought back or created a considerable amount of wealth, and some of the crusading orders of these warrior monks, in particular the Knights Templar of the Holy Grail fame, that whole legend, the Knights Templar in particular became very, very wealthy as a result of their involvement in the Crusades. In fact, when we were talking about that, I mentioned the fact that part of the banking system in Europe traces its history to the Knights Templar and the Crusades, because they set up a system in which people could deposit money in Europe, then travel without carrying their money with them to the Holy Land, and then they could withdraw those funds in the Holy Land when they got there, deposit them then when they left, and then come back to Europe and withdraw them there. So kind of an early ATM system was set up by some of these crusading orders, and that start of, rudimentary very much, but kind of the start of some of the early modern economics that we see in Europe today. All right, I just have a few notes here on Roman Catholic activity and theology during the Middle Ages. We're not going to talk through this in detail. I just want to survey some of these things. The Inquisitions, the Crusades are over by 1295, by the time we get to the end of the 13th century, and yet Inquisitions continue in Europe. They are most well known in Spain, as Christians in Spain attempt to finally and fully push the Muslim influence completely out of Spain. And often these inquisitions result in execution, because we are at a time now where because there's a marriage of church and state, to be in opposition to the church, to be a heretic, is considered a capital offense. It is not only to have, rebelled against the church, but also to have essentially committed treason against the state, since the church and state are so tightly woven together. And part of the reason that heretics are killed is because the state enforces capital punishment against those whom the church deems as a threat to the doctrine or unity of the church. And the Inquisitions are a vivid example of that. And Spain's not the only place where they took place. It happens throughout all of Europe. But even when we get to the Reformation, many Protestants are going to be killed by Catholics because heresy is considered a capital crime. And even within Protestant countries, some of the Anabaptists are going to be killed by fellow Protestants because they're viewed as enemies not only of the church but also of the state. So we see again a influx of persecution against true believers within the former Roman Empire, but this time it's not a pagan state that is persecuting them. It is a supposedly Christian state that is now persecuting Christians. And you see that in Fox's Book of Martyrs. So Fox starts with the early martyrs, and then he moves fast forward to the Reformation martyrs. Angels and the superstition that begins to creep into medieval Christianity is rampant, seen in relics. We've talked a little bit about relics already. A lot of things brought back from the Crusades, where somebody finds a splinter of wood in Jerusalem and they take it back home and they say, look, I think this came from Jesus' cross, and suddenly it becomes a relic. And there's nothing to support it except that a guy in the 11th century found a splinter of wood in Jerusalem and brought it home. So that kind of stuff is taking place. The elevation of Mary is continuing to escalate. And we've already talked a little bit about how Mary and the other saints came to be elevated in the Roman Catholic system, largely as a carryover from Roman paganism. Those deities, gods and goddesses of the Roman and Greek pantheons, were simply borrowed and Christianized, and so we have the veneration of the saints, which looks almost identical to the pagan worship of those pagan deities. The use of images we've talked about already, the whole scandal at the Second Council of Nicaea with the iconoclasts and the iconodules. And miracles and sacraments, as I mentioned, this is a period of time where the sacramental system is being codified. So as you can see there, by the 13th century, we have officially now 7 sacraments. I always think it's ironic that within the Roman Catholic system, no one can do all 7. Because being a priest is one of the sacraments, and getting married is one of the sacraments. So the best you can do is 6 out of 7. You kind of pick and choose. But in any case, baptism is considered a sacrament, and confirmation, the Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, which is getting all of your sins forgiven right before you die so that you don't have to spend as much time in purgatory, ordination or becoming a priest, and then marriage, if you decide not to become a priest, are the final 2 of the 7 sacraments. And at this time period now, again, what in earlier time periods was seen as really a spiritual discipline. We talk about spiritual disciplines, and sometimes we call those spiritual disciplines disciplines of grace. And we say that there's a certain amount of enjoyment or of the exercise or appreciation of God's grace that we experience when we are disciplined in these ways. I think we sometimes have to be careful how we talk about that, because that language can start to sound sacramental, because sacramentalism is this idea that God's grace is given to you through these activities. Well, sanctifying grace, sure. Justifying grace, no. But that's where the confusion seeped into Roman Catholic thinking. What started as a means of sanctification eventually became a means of justification, and that's where the true gospel was eclipsed. That brings us then to the end of the Middle Ages, with the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. You'll remember in 1204, the Fourth Crusade, there were these Christian soldiers from the West who were supposed to go down across the Mediterranean Sea and attack Jerusalem from the south in order to reconquer the Holy Land from the infidels. But they didn't have money for boats, so they went east to Constantinople because the emperor who had been recently deposed promised them the money that they needed if they would restore him to power. And when he got restored to power, he didn't have the money. He said, give me 6 months. In those 6 months, he was killed by a usurper. The usurper said, I don't care about the Crusaders. The Crusaders said, hey, if we're not getting our money, we're taking it. They attacked Constantinople. They pillaged the city, plundered its riches, and took a lot of that stuff back with them to Europe, left the city of Constantinople very, very weak and vulnerable, and they even set up crusader kingdoms around the Byzantine Empire and really handicapped the Byzantine Empire to a point that it would never recover from. It still took 150 years after that for the Byzantine Empire to finally and fully fall. The city of Constantinople, what today is Istanbul, Turkey, and the city of Constantinople, arguably, I don't even know if it's arguable, by most accounts, was the most magnificent city in all of Europe up to that time period. I mean, it had been the capital city of the Roman Empire for a millennium, and so it was regarded as the nicest, richest, most defensible city in all of Europe. I mean, it really was the height of European civilization at the time. The nicest church in all of Europe was there in Constantinople, known as the Church of Holy Wisdom, or the Hagia Sophia. And when the Fourth Crusade, when those Western soldiers pillaged Constantinople, I mentioned this in a previous class, they took a whole lot of that wealth with them back to Europe, and in particular the Venetians brought a lot of things back on their ships. And in Venice today you can see a lot of Byzantine art that's there that really was taken from Constantinople and brought to Venice. It's kind of like if you want to experience Egypt, you have to stop at the British Museum. You're like, how did this happen? This is not Egypt. It's because a lot of stuff was taken from Egypt and brought to Britain, but it's a different subject and a different time period in church history. By the time we get to 1453, then, the writings on the wall for Constantinople, it has been ever since the Fourth Crusade. The Crusades were initiated to try and save the Eastern Roman Empire from Muslim advance. It took a long time, but the Crusades actually made the problem worse. And so the problem they were intended to solve, they actually, created the end they were hoping to avoid. So, in any case, 1453, here we are. Mehmed II, the Sultan of the Ottoman Turks, brings an army of 80,000 troops to surround the city of Constantinople. Now, Constantinople is like an impenetrable fortress. It has the strait there between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea that gives it a defense on one side by water, and then it has these huge walls on the other side. It is, of all the things we talk about in church history, this battle is a scene out of a Lord of the Rings movie. All right, so if you have read the J.R.R. Tolkien books, or if you've seen those movies, or if you haven't and you can just imagine an awesome fortress surrounded by a huge army, the difference is that in the Lord of the Rings, the guys inside the castle ultimately win the battle. In church history, or in reality, the guys inside the castle don't win the battle, and they ultimately lose. One of the kind of interesting anecdotes from this battle in church history is that it was the first major battle where gunpowder was used, which is why it signals the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern age. Not only does it represent the final and full collapse of the Roman Empire, remember the western half fell in 476, now the eastern half has finally fallen. What's the past tense of fell? Fallen, right. So here we are, there's been a 1,000 years between the fall of the West and the fall of the East, and that 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages. But we're also now entering the modern age because gunpowder and technology is starting to be used even in weaponry. So all the way back in 1453. There was a guy who he was, I have to go back and remember what his name was. I think it was Orban, Orban, I think was his name. He was an engineer, and he built a catapult, essentially. Well, a cannon, not a catapult, a cannon, because he used gunpowder, and it was known as his bombard. So he develops this new technology, this bombard, this cannon, and this cannon is able to shoot, I think it was something like 3 miles, but it could only be shot once every couple of hours or something like that, because it like expended everything and then it had to be reset up and reloaded. But it was this massive deal. And so he came to Constantinople and he offered his technology to the people of Constantinople and essentially said, look, I need this amount of money, and if you pay me this amount of money, I'll supply you with this cannon, this bombard, which is going to give you this technological, tactical advantage in the fight. Well, they didn't have the money to pay him. So, like any good military contractor, he left and went to Mehmed II and said, hey, you know, I offered my technology to them. They didn't want it, or they couldn't afford it. How about you guys? You want it? And Mehmed was like, sure. So the bombard was actually used then by the Muslim armies to a limited effectiveness, only because it took so long to reload. But it actually did quite a bit of damage to the wall that was protecting the city of Constantinople. And of course, after this time period, it's only a matter of time when walls no longer become effective as a means of defense, because gunpowder shoots through walls or over walls. And it won't be long before walls are no longer an adequate means of military defense. So all of this is happening during this period of time, and it's kind of a fun story to it doesn't end well for the people of Constantinople, though Mehmed II does allow a certain level of toleration and a certain level of religious freedom even after he conquers the city. They're able to hold off this force. I mean, there's only 7,000 soldiers inside the city. There's 80,000 soldiers outside the city, and the soldiers on the outside of the city have this new weaponry that gives them at least a psychological advantage. So this is very much something out of Lord of the Rings, except Gandalf never shows up to save the day. These 7,000 troops are able to hold off these 80,000 troops from April 5th until May 29th of 1453. And on May 29th, the Muslim armies finally break through the city's defenses and they take the capital city. The Hagia Sophia, this beautiful church, is converted into a mosque, and it's still a mosque today in the city of Istanbul. And if you go to Istanbul, you can see the inside of the city, inside of that church building or that mosque. It's a pretty popular tourist attraction there in the city of Istanbul. The other church within the city, the Church of the Holy Apostles, is still a Christian church, an Eastern Orthodox church, and there is still a Patriarch of Constantinople who is the bishop of that church. So, I've already talked about how the fall of Constantinople marks the end of the Middle Ages. I guess there is a second reason here, not only because of gunpowder being used, but then secondly, because many of the Greeks, the Greek-speaking inhabitants of the Eastern Roman Empire, they fled from Constantinople and came to Italy. And in much the same way that the Fourth Crusade, with all those stolen goods, had begun to spark a reformation of sorts, now this influx of learning, of riches, of trained artisans, and so on from Constantinople helps to spark the Italian Renaissance. So in many ways, the Renaissance in Europe is more a result of the destruction of the eastern part of the Roman Empire than it really was the innovation of Western thinkers. They benefited from the demise of the eastern half of the Byzantine Empire. There were some movements in Europe after this to try and organize a crusade. That does not sound like a good idea. To try and retake Constantinople. but by this time the power of the papacy had greatly declined, which we've already talked about, and so none of the European monarchs wanted to spend the time or the money to go and try and oust the Muslim forces from Constantinople. And so ever since 1453, Istanbul has been under Muslim occupation, and of course it remains in Turkish Muslim hands even today. And you can see how the Ottoman Empire had completely surrounded the tiny little purple sliver here, and Constantinople is right here where the arrow is, and so the Byzantine Empire had become a very much just a small little shell of what it had been at the height of its power. Yep.
Who were the Knights of St. John?
The Knights of St. John were the Hospitallers that goes all the way back to the Crusades. They were, along with the Knights Templar, they were another one of those warrior monks, order of warrior monks. And the reason they're called the Hospitallers is because along the route, and then in the Holy Land itself, they set up a system of, very rudimentary, but set up a system of hospitals. And so people who were wounded or sick had a place that they could be cared for. So if the Templars kind of gave us a rudimentary banking system, the Hospitallers kind of give us a rudimentary healthcare system, even in the crusading age.
Are they the same as the Teutonic Knights?
No, the Teutonic Knights is a third group of warrior monks, but the Teutonic Knights are the ones who were involved in fighting the Northern Crusades, the Crusades that we never hear about because they were successful. So the Northern Crusades successfully Christianized the area around the Baltic Sea. So Sweden, Finland, Denmark, that area up in there was Christianized. Kind of some last remaining pagan tribal groups that were then Christianized through the efforts of these warrior monks, the Teutonic Knights.
I don't know if you've heard this, but I heard that the Teutonic Knights somehow may have been involved in the assassination of Hitler. Did you?
I am not familiar of that story, but I don't know. I know that Bonhoeffer was involved in an attempt to assassinate Hitler, but I don't think Bonhoeffer was a Teutonic Knight. So,
Like an epic movie.
yeah, no, this is great. This is starting to sound like one of Dr. Farnell's classes, where we, if we can't remember the history, we'll just create it. Conspiracy theories. Well, let's do this. This brings us to the next lecture on the forerunners to the Reformation. And I think what I'm going to do, since we only have 5 minutes left in the class, is I'll leave most of this to next time, though I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to go through the review for exam number 3. But I hope what we're doing in this class, the reason I'm giving you the details that I'm giving you, not only because it's the history that we have to cover, but the purpose behind it is I want to set in your minds the table for why a Reformation was necessary and how a Reformation was possible and why did it happen when it happened. And it has to do with a lot of the geopolitical factors that were taking place in Europe at that time. Of course, that's on the human level. On the divine level, it happened exactly when God wanted it to happen within his sovereign providential plan. But one thing that you're going to be encouraged about next time when we come back on Thursday, besides the test review, which I know is very edifying and encouraging to all of you, but one thing that you'll be encouraged by is even as we come to a time now in the 13th century, the 1200s, where the sacramental synergistic system of Catholicism is being entrenched. And as we come into the 14th century, the 1300s, where the papacy is going through this very weird schizophrenic time where it can't figure out if it's going to be in Rome or in France, and then it can't figure out who the real pope is because there's multiple popes. Even in the midst of all of that, there are already voices that are standing up and saying this has to change. Martin Luther does not spark the Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther sees himself not as the initiator, but as someone who is part of a long line of voices of reason and reform that finally culminates in the 16th century. But we go back to the Waldensians really in the 12th century is where they started. And then the Lollards under John Wycliffe. And then the Hussites under John Huss, and eventually the Moravian movement that comes out of that. And then we get to Martin Luther. So I think you'll be encouraged next time to start to see that there are voices of reform long before Martin Luther. And that's all going to build and climax when we get back in January with the Reformation of the Church.